Yes, I will discuss one of the deadliest diseases of honeybees in the world, and that is this infestation by this parasitic mite called the varroa mite. The species is actually Varroa destructor. This mite is the number one killer of honeybees in the world. It's usually in combination with other stressors that it can lead to major problems for beekeepers. But but basically, the mite itself and the viruses it vectors to the bees can, in and of it by itself, can kill bees. So, in combination with other stressors such as exposure to pesticides or poor nutrition, it can be really deadly. But even by itself and the viruses that are vectored by the mite, they are deadly to bees as well. So this is a little bit about the biology of the mites and how to control them. And I'm only doing this, this is sort of an optional slideshow for you because we're going to talk about, I'm going to show you how to sample bees for the mite at our next meeting outside at the tent. So that's why I wanted to give you this talk. So again, the mite is called Varroa destructor. This is it here. It's actually a fairly large mite. This is the large female mite on the back of a worker honeybee. This mite originated on a different species of bees, of honeybees. It was the Indian honeybee, which is Apis cerana. Our honeybee is Apis mellifera, and it kind of goes this way. There was a long evolutionary history of this mite with Apis cerana. As a consequence, they sort of have a balanced host-parasite relationship, and these mites do not kill Apis cerana. But what happened is no one knows exactly when, but it seems like maybe over 150 years ago, our honeybee was brought into contact with the other honeybee in Asia. Some people think it was in Russia, Eastern Russia, like Siberia. And the mites jumped onto a new host that has not had an evolutionary history with the mite, and therefore they're fairly defenseless. And and since that time, this mite has had devastating effects on beekeeping throughout the world. When this mite is not trying to reproduce, it rides on adult bees, and we call that the mite sphoretic phase. And they generally are on adult bees for 7 to 10 days in between their reproductive bouts when they're trying to raise a family. When the mite is ready to raise a family, she invades the brood cell of the last instar bee larva. It's that bee larva just before the workers put the brown cap on. The mite sneaks down in the cell and hides under the larva. Then the adult bees cap it, and as soon as the larva has eaten all of its larval food and spins a cocoon, the mite wakes up and starts to feed on the larva and then later instars of the pupa. And she uses nutrition from those stages of bee development to lay her own eggs. And every 30 hours, she lays an egg that becomes a nymph, and these nymphs grow. And the whole family, mother and nymphs, feed on the developing honeybee during the cat period, which is about 12 days. And during that time, a mother mite's doing well if she can mature two daughter mites that come out of the cell with her. So one mother mite came in and two daughters come out. That's the best she can do. Just so you know, the biology, there's only one male produced, and he mates with his sisters. And he does not leave the brood cell. He dies in the brood cell. So it's a very interesting system. This is a mite family that's in a worker brood cell after the worker pupa was removed to take the photograph. And so you can see here's the mother mite. This is her son, her oldest son, only son. And then these are female mites at different stages of development. Here's the oldest female daughter. Here's another daughter, a younger daughter, and there's an egg that would become a daughter. Gives you an idea of how big these things are relative to the bee pupa. And of course, the problem is these mites are feeding on fat body tissues of the bee. And as a consequence, the bees are often born underweight, 30 to 40% underweight. But worse is that the mite, their feeding behavior, the continuous feeding behavior actually vectors viruses to our bees. And this is an adult bee. She was fed upon as a developing honeybee, but she survived it, but she got a virus from that infestation. And oftentimes bees infected with viruses will lose their hair and they kind of turn black and shiny, look kind of oily. And I think in this photo, you can actually pick out sort of this bee is not obviously infected, but that one is, and even that one looks infected with some kind of virus. So you can see at least 3 individuals that look sick among the group that aren't. And perhaps one of the worst viruses, it turns out there's about 20 different viruses or more. I think they're up to 25 viruses now that are vectored by these mites to our bees. But only a handful of them are the major killers. And one of those is known as deformed wing virus. And it's called that because this is a common symptom of that viral infection. The wings don't develop properly. And these bees will barely live. You know, you should know by now that bees in the summertime should live at least 45 days. This bee may not even live 10 days with this viral infection. And that's kind of how the mites kill a colony of bees. When the mite population gets high, they vector high levels of viruses to the bees. And when bees get high levels of viruses, they don't live very long, and the colony begins to dwindle and die as young bees die, have premature, short-lived lives, and they die. Um, so that's the major problem. And so that is one of the major symptoms. When a colony of bees dies from varroa mites, they just sort of dwindle and become a very small colony that's not able to function. And what's interesting is these bees that are infested, if they try and leave the colony because they try and remove themselves from the nest because they know they're sick. So they don't die and fall on the floor necessarily. They try and leave the colony. So if they can fly, they'll fly out and die and not return. And sometimes they'll just fall on the ground and die in the grass. So anyway, I'm going to demonstrate sampling of this mite in the field with you, but this is one of the sampling devices. We're basically going to This is basically a plastic basket that fits inside a plastic container that can hold alcohol. And what we're going to do is put a half cup of bees inside this plastic, pour some alcohol in there, put the lid on real quick and kill the bees. And then what you do is once you get the lid on, you shake this and you agitate it, and the mites will be shaken off the bees, and you can actually collect the mites or see them in the bottom of the sampling device. Generally, we put in a half a cup of bees, and I just automatically say that half a cup of bees is about 400 bees. It's a pretty crude measure. Obviously, you can count the bees if you want, but I find you don't have to be that accurate. You can just assume it's 400 bees. And so here's how you sample, and probably the most important thing to remember when sampling for this mite is that you need to sample the right age of bees. This mite prefers the young bees that take care of the brood. So if you look at this frame, there's cap brood, and you can't tell, but you can see there's not cap brood in the center. This is actually right here in the center of the brood frame, a bunch of bee larvae. And so these are young nurse bees taking care of that larvae, and this is the perfect kind of frame to sample. And what I like to do is when I go into a colony of bees, I find the queen and set her aside because you don't want to accidentally get her in the sample that's going to be killed with alcohol. So you find her and set her aside to make sure she's safe. And then you find two combs that have that kind of young bees on it that are nursing and taking care of brood. And what I do is I shake the bees from both combs into a 5-gallon bucket. Then I mix the bees up, and then I scoop out a half cup. Now, most people use just a half cup to take out the bees. I use a full cup and just kind of shake the bees down until it's about half a cup. It doesn't really matter. You just want to try and get a half cup of bees, and you put a little alcohol in there, and then you throw the bees in there, and the alcohol kills them. Then you fill it up with alcohol, and you agitate it, and you can see this is a horrible mite load there. You can count the mites through the bottom of the sampling device. I can show you. I also use sometimes enamel bed pans are a good way to pour the alcohol out and spread the mites out and count them that way. I'll show you that in the field. But you get the idea. You're basically killing a subsample of bees, dislodging the mites from them, and kind of estimating how many mites per bee do you have is what we're trying to do. And we do that because we like to talk about mite loads. And when I say 1% threshold, what I'm saying is 1% means I got one mite for every 100 bees in the sample. So in February and March, I will treat a colony. If I sample in February and I find 4 mites or more in that sample that we just took, I will treat the colony because I know that that level's high enough that by the time I get my honey off, which is going to be in June and July, my colony can be in trouble and sick if I don't act. Similarly, so it turns out there's a sample, there's also a threshold that's used in the summertime after you take your honey off. And most people use this one, it's 3%, 3 mites per 100 bees. I show you this complicated slide because it kind of shows you the things a beekeeper has to think about when they're thinking about treating their bees for mites using a chemical. Some chemicals can't be used when you're making honey. In fact, they have to stop being used sometimes 2 or 3 weeks in front of making honey. And then the other thing is you don't want a lot of chemicals being used when you're making your winter bees in September and October. But also, even worse, you don't want a high virus loads when you're making your winter bees because viruses will compromise these bees and they won't live very long and your colony will die in the wintertime. So this is complicated. And on top of all that, we have what are called soft chemicals and hard chemicals. Hard chemicals are neurotoxic insecticides like we use for other insects. And then soft chemicals are things like organic acids and something called thymol. Um, and some of the soft chemicals are best used when it's cooler time of the year, like coming out of winter and late fall. But they're not safe to be used in the heat of the summer, at least some of them. And then one of the problems with hard chemicals is they tend to leave bigger residues in our comb for longer periods of time. And that's one reason people prefer the soft chemicals. These formic acid and oxalic acid may only be around in a colony for days and they're probably clear out by weeks. Some of the hard chemicals we've used as insecticides have half-lives of over 5 years, which means the chemicals are in our wax for over a decade or more. So that's why a lot of people try and use the softer chemicals if they can. So, like I said, most people use a 3% summer threshold, and that means for every 100 bees, if you get more than 3 mites, then you need to treat. So if our sample size is 400, that means if we get more than 12 mites or more, we're at threshold and we need to do something to protect our bees or they're going to be in trouble. So that's what that threshold means. Now I just want to show you some of the chemicals, and I guess the first thing I want to tell you is we don't have that many miticides that can be used in bee colonies. This is one of the hard chemicals. It's amitraz. It's a neurotoxin. It's become a favorite of beekeepers because of the neurotoxins. It actually has a fairly low residue time in the combs. It's weeks to months at the most. It has a pretty good kill rate. If used properly, you can kill more than 95% of the mites in a colony of bees. But the problem is our commercial beekeeping industry has used this chemical over and over and over consecutive years in a row, and we're starting to get mite populations that are resistant to the chemical. So that's probably the biggest problem with that one. I still use it because I have yet to see resistance in my bees, but I'm well aware that one day I might get resistance. So I use it. I don't use it every year. One of the soft chemicals is thymol, and there are different formulations of thymol. This one is the fairly low temperature one. It's dangerous above 86 degrees. What it is there's these wafers that can break into four. And when it's warm outside, this wafer releases the thymol too quickly and it can kill your bees. So I don't actually like using this one because of that risk. There's a different formulation of thymol called Apiguard. This is much safer, has a higher temperature limit. So I prefer to use this one because generally if I'm going to use thymol, it's going to be in the warmer time of the year. And this is much safer for our environment. So I feel happier about using this one than I do the previous form. When it comes to soft chemicals, formic acid is a very strong organic acid, and it has been known to kill baby bees, the bee brood, but it can be very effective at killing mites at relatively low temperature range. You definitely don't want to use this in warmer temperatures above 85. You can kill a lot of bees. So really, I tend to use this one mostly in the springtime, like February, March, if I need to use a chemical then. Oxalic acid, I'm going to talk more about it because this has become a favorite of beekeepers all around the United States, but there's been some issues. These 4 areas of issues have come up lately, and I kind of want to address them each. One is there are different methods of delivery. When oxalic acid was first recommended, a lot of times the scientists would recommend doing the trickle method. And basically what they're doing is they're dissolving oxalic acid in sugar syrup and they're trickling it onto a cluster of bees when it's cool outside. Um, I'm now no longer recommending that because we don't get warm enough, cool enough to have a good cluster. And scientists have shown that this method of actually vaporizing the acid works best. It's more effective. And the idea here is you're taking the organic acid, you're putting it on a heater, hooking it to a car battery, you're stuffing the entrance closed, and it will sublimate. The acid will sublimate and coat the bees and the entire surface of the hive in a 15-minute period. And during that time, it will coat everything and it'll kill the mites over the next few days. And this is proven to be the most effective. Done properly, you can kill 95% of the mites in a colony. So if you're ever asked which method is best, scientists now are saying the vaporization method is preferred. Now, there's also been this issue of whether or not using it multiple times in the summertime would be effective at controlling mites. And I want to demonstrate that it's not. And I do it with this hypothetical bee colony. Let's assume we have a bee colony with 60,000 bees in it. And let's pretend we actually know the mite population is 5,500 mites. So one question is, if we actually wash the bees, if we shook 2 combs of bees out of the brood nest, like I described earlier, what would our mite load be on those bees? And you might be tempted to say, well, it's 5,500 divided by 60. Well, that'd be wrong because what you have to understand is only 1/3 of the mites are on the adult bees. Whenever you have brood around, because this is the problem, in May, the colony is full of brood. So whenever you have brood around, about 2/3 of the mites are actually in the brood. So only 1/3 of the mites, of the 5,500 mites, are actually on the adult bees. So 1/3 of that divided by 60, and that gives us the 3% mite load, which is at the threshold we need to treat for spring, summer. All right, so again, whenever there's brood around, 2/3 of the mite populations are in the brood and 1/3 of the mites are on adult bees. So if you blast this with oxalic acid does not go through the caps, and it will not hurt any of these mites in the cap brood. It can only affect the mites that are on the adult bees. All right. So what a lot of beekeepers try and do, they say, okay, well, I'll zap them 1 week and I'll kill as many mites as I can on the adult bees. Then I'll wait a week and I'll do it again, and then I'll wait a week and do it again. And they think they're doing something, and I want to show you that that can be fairly ineffective. So let's just start. Let's say we're going to do our first vaporization. Scientists have found basically that you can get a 95% kill rate of the mites that are actually hit by the acid. And so if you look at our example, there's only 1,800 mites on the bees. 95% of them are killed. That means 92 lived and survived that, and the other 3,600 mites are in the cap brood. That means after the first treatment, this is the total number of living mites left in the hive. Then we're going to come back a week later and do it again. So again, now this is the mite load. This is the overall mite load. Here's what's in adult bees. We kill that many. This is how many are left in the brood. And then we're going to do it a third time. The same assumptions, 95% kill rate. And we're finally left with a total of 2,600 mites in the hive. And you might say, wow, that's 3 weeks in a row of treating. And I really knocked the mite load down from 5,500 mites in the colony down to 2,600. So my question to you is, how fast will this get back to threshold? And to answer that, you would have to know something about bee biology. And I've spent 15 years studying how mite populations grow. And it turns out the exponential growth equation can work for short periods of time in varroa mites. And what this says is the population at time 2 is equal to the population at time 1 times E, which is natural log R to the n. And E is the base of the natural log. R is what's called the intrinsic growth rate. And the lowest average I ever measured was 0.1. And N is the number of weeks. So this is 0.1 per week, number of weeks. And so my question to you is, what is the mite population after 6 weeks? You plug everything into this equation. Let's see, we use 2,600 times, and anyway, we end up with 4,865 mites, which is right at the 3% threshold. So within 6 weeks of your treatment sequence, you're right back to threshold again, and that puts you right in the middle of the summer, and you really haven't done much. You're basically not keeping your bees out of harm's way for very long. And it turns out this is the lowest average growth rate I've measured. The highest I ever measured was 0.2. So when you look at that value, you're actually, after 6 weeks, your colonies are already sick. Because my experience is once bees get to 8,000 to 9,000 mites, they start to look sick and the colony can show signs of dying. So before I go on to the next bullet point, I do want to comment that one way you can enhance the effectiveness of oxalic acid is simply to cage your queen for 2 weeks and then allow all the brood emerge on day 21 before you treat. So the idea is you cage the queen on day 1, you let her go on day 14, and then by day 21, all the old brood has emerged, but none of the young brood that she's produced from this point on has been capped yet. So if you treat on this day, all the mites are adult bees and you'll kill all of them. The problem is when you cage queens like this, even for 2 weeks, their feet get damaged. And when their feet get damaged, the bees don't like them anymore and they will kill them and try and replace them. So this is risky to cage your queen for 2 weeks in order to do that. So there's different tricks you could do. Rather than cage her, put her in a little cage, you could actually take a couple combs and put her in a nuke and set her aside. Let the brood emerge, then put her back in there, then take this brood away, these couple frames of brood away, to another apiary where you're going to treat them for varroa mites later, and then treat on the 21st day. So that's kind of a way of caging her. By not caging her, you're just sort of taking a small part of the colony, setting her aside, let the brood develop, and then put her back and then treat. And it's the same as caging her. An even better way is simply to take, there's a device we have that's called a queen excluder. It's basically a screen where the worker bees can go through the screen, but the queen cannot. So what you can do is on day 1, you can move the queen above the excluder and put her on brand new comb or empty comb that has no brood. And then on day 14, put her below the excluder, and then you can take this brood away. And again, you would treat that with, treat it for mites later. But when you put her back on the 21st day, you treat this unit and kill all the mites that are on the adult bees. And that works pretty well. This is what I do. So the idea is the same as caging the queen without restricting her in a tiny cage. You're just sort of moving her around so you get the same effect as if she was caged down here. But the idea is when you do that, basically when all this brood emerges, there's no place for the mice to hide, and then you zap them with the oxalic acid. So again, in general, serial applications of oxalic acid in the summertime are likely to be pretty ineffective at controlling the mites. You're going to be disappointed if you think they control them. Dose is an issue. What's happened is EPA has changed a policy on when they'll allow oxalic acid to be used. It used to not be, you couldn't use it when you were making honey, but now that they're allowing it, people have tried to do the serial thing I just mentioned, but they also want to use a higher dose. Legal dose is 1 gram of acid per box of bees. But there's been a couple of scientists out there that found that they need 4 grams per box of bees or more to get adequate control. But what's interesting is studies in England show that 1 gram per box, or Europe found that 1 gram per box. So the problem is these two scientists are talking around the country and beekeepers are saying, well, I need to do 4 grams, but that's against the law. EPA hasn't approved it yet. So I'm trying to tell beekeepers only use the legal dose, no matter what scientists say, until EPA changes it. And I know that's kind of a nerdy way to stick with things, but I just think that's the best policy. Just always follow the rules and regulations of how to use an insecticide. So I'm going to say always use 1. And then finally, there's been a couple mouths in the beekeeping industry saying that because oxalic acid is free to use now when we're producing honey, that you can experiment. You can freely experiment with different doses and different ways of delivering it to control mites. And this has been written about and talked about. And I'm going to say it's absolutely wrong. Only EPA can approve who gets an experimental use permit. And you need an experimental use permit to do experiments with insecticides in your bee colonies. So there's a whole document that governs who can use this and get one. You have to actually apply for it, and EPA actually has to give it to you. You can't just go out and do anything you want to do, which is what the scientist who spoke about this at a national meeting, he created quite an uproar. So I'll stop about amitraz. I do want to say some oxalic acid. I do want to say some things in general about insecticide use. Probably our biggest problem is our beekeepers are not rotating their chemicals, especially our commercial beekeepers. They really favored Amitraz and they used it every year. Some of them have used it for 15 years or more in a row. And unfortunately, when you do that, never rotating chemicals, you're going to put a lot of selection pressure on the mites to become resistant to the chemicals. And so here's an example. I mean, insecticide resistance is nothing new. This is sort of looking at the problem of insecticide resistance in general. You know, the first insecticides used in the United States were back here, and resistance was not unheard of. And then suddenly, you know, by the time we get in the 70s, and when we started using more synthetic insecticides, you can see the incidence of insecticide resistant populations has grown. And so why do insects become resistant? And here's the full first documented case. Sulfur lime was used to control the San Jose scale, and this scale became resistant to the sulfur lime. And we now have many, many insects of our crop pests that are resistant to, look, many of them are resistant to more than one compound. Look, 93 different compounds they're resistant to, number of actual independent cases of where they're resistant, that kind of thing. It's pretty common in farming now. And so how do you get insecticide resistance? Well, many things happen, but it's basically because of rapid reproduction and migration of insects, and we're applying selection pressure with the insecticides. So here's sort of a cartoon of what's happening. So when you first start using insecticide, you have basically a resistant population of a susceptible population of insects. And there's very rare individuals, maybe 1 in a million, that have genes, random mutations that might confer resistance to the insecticide. So you spray, you kill most of the susceptibles, you don't kill them all, but the proportion of the population now, you don't kill the resistant one, so the proportion of the resistant insects in the population is higher. Well, these insects mate and the genes, these resistant genes increase, and so the next time you come to spray, you've got a lot more, higher percentage of resistant insects in the population. You spray and you actually, it's even worse the next time. So now when this population, so you can see how fast insecticide resistance can develop. And so I just want to emphasize that point because the same thing can happen with mites. So I just want to show you that with that in mind, I'm very cognizant of trying to rotate my modes of action, and that is, how is my insecticide acting on the insect? Well, Amitraz acts specifically at octopamine receptors in the insect. So I use it 1 year, and then the next year, if I need to kill mites, I want to use something that's totally different and acts different in the insect. So I use thymol because it's acting at a different part of the nervous system. It's acting on GABA-gated chloride channels in the insect's central nervous system. So it's kind of acting like benzodiazepines or Valium in our nervous system. It kind of is a depressant, and so it acts that way. And then this year I used organic acids, especially formic acid, and it's actually poisoning mitochondrial oxidative phosphorylation. And so I purposely use 3 different chemicals in rotation because they have different modes of action or sites of action inside the physiology of insects. And by doing that, if I have a population of insects that might be resistant to this one, they're not going to be resistant to this one, so they get wiped out by this one. If something has a little bit of resistance to this, when I go to this, they're not. And so by rotating those modes of actions, I really delay resistance to any of these compounds. The next few slides just show you that these modes of actions are known. Octopamine receptors are inside the insect central nervous system, and we know how they act. I won't dwell on this. GABA-gated chloride channels are also in the insect nervous system, and this is where the thymol's acting. And like I said, benzodiazepines like Valium act on the ones in our system. And then this is the oxidative phosphorylation, which we have in our mitochondria. So do bees and so do mites, but the organic acids are tweaked to where they affect the mites more than they do the bees. So again, that's just emphasizing the need to rotate chemicals. So just to summarize sort of a integrated pest management summary for varroa mites, I like to sample at least twice a year, once in February and once in early July. And I only treat when the populations exceed my thresholds, and those thresholds were 1% in February, 3% this time of year. Rotate among different modes of action. And then other things I can do, anything I can do to keep mites from moving between bee colonies, if I can increase the distance between bee yards, or also even between colonies, if I can space my colonies at greater distances between one another, that reduces the ability of mites to drift on bees between colonies. There are people who are breeding resistant bee stock that do resist the mites. So I can use those, and I can do things like use screen floors, which gets some help. Mites can fall through these screens and not get able to get back on the bees. It's a very modest help, but any help will do. And just unfortunately, this is our worst problem in beekeeping, and all beekeepers have to figure out what they're going to do to manage it. Not everybody wants to use chemicals in their hives, and some people want to do what's called natural beekeeping, and that is they don't want to use chemicals at all to control their mites. They want to do cultural things or let the bees live more like nature would want them as a way to control the mites. And the problem with that is if it's not standalone, you still need to intervene and you need to know what kind of mite loads your bees are experiencing, otherwise they're going to die. Um, so I tend to be in the middle. I do like to do cultural things that don't require chemicals to help control mites, but I also am not afraid to use chemicals when I need to, and I just try and use those that are safest for the bees. Um, and that's all. I just want to make sure you guys understood a little bit about varroa management as a preference to what we're going to do outside.